Shindara was tied to a chair, blindfolded still, her wrists raw from struggle. The sound of gunfire had driven the guards into chaos, leaving her momentarily unguarded. He rushed to her, tearing the gag from her mouth. Her first word was not fear, it was fury. "Jihoon?" she gasped. Her voice cracked on his name. He was already cutting the rope. "We have to go. Are you hurt?"
Welcome to Mafia Love Story, where passion meets the power. If you crave steamy romance mixed with intense crime thriller drama, you're in the right place. Ready to get hooked on your next obsession? Don't forget to like this story, subscribe for the next chapter, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get dangerous.
Some nights rewrite a man's soul. For Kang Jihoon, this one began with blood on his hands and ended with a prayer he didn't believe in. He drove through the Lagos rain with nothing but the sound of his breath and the image of Shindara bound and blindfolded. Each flash of lightning painted the road in silver ghosts, faces he'd lost, faces he might yet lose. The warehouse she'd been taken to sat near the same docks where he had first stumbled into her. Shindara, bleeding, half dead, and desperate. Fate, it seemed, had an appetite for irony. The night air was heavy, wet with the taste of salt and gasoline. He parked the car 2 blocks away and slipped out with the quiet grace of a predator. The gun in his hand felt heavier than it should. He had used it to end lives before, but tonight it was heavier because of the one he meant to save. Inside the warehouse, shadows swayed under the dim, flickering bulbs. Men stood guard, armed, bored, dangerous, the kind of men who killed not for loyalty, but for pay. Jihoon moved between steel pillars and crates, silent as water. His father's voice echoed in his head, a ghostly memory. Power isn't mercy, son. Mercy gets you killed. But Shindara had changed that rule. She had made mercy look like courage. He crept closer until he could hear her breathing, faint, uneven. He could picture her, hands tied, jaw clenched in defiance, even in fear. He almost smiled through the ache in his chest. She was fire wrapped in softness, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. A guard turned, catching the faint glint of Jihoon's weapon. The man's shout cut through the silence like a blade. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through wood and air, shattering glass, ripping through the stillness of night. Jihoon moved fast, precise. The rhythm of violence was familiar to him. His training, his instincts, the brutality he thought he'd buried all came roaring back. He took down the first 3 men before the 4th got a shot off, grazing Jihoon's shoulder, spinning him sideways. Pain bloomed hot, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He kicked open a side door, finding the room where she was kept. Shindara was tied to a chair, blindfolded still, her wrists raw from struggle. The sound of gunfire had driven the guards into chaos, leaving her momentarily unguarded. He rushed to her, tearing the gag from her mouth. Her first word was not fear, it was fury. "Jihoon," she gasped. Her voice cracked on his name. He was already cutting the rope. "We have to go." "Are you hurt?" He didn't answer. A crash from the hallway answered for him. More men were coming. He pulled her up, pressing her close for just a second. The first human moment in what felt like a Shindara's time running. "Stay behind me," he said, voice low, command wrapped in care. She nodded, her eyes wide with something between anger and disbelief. The next minutes unfolded like a nightmare painted in rain and gunfire. They fought their way out, Jihoon leading, Shindara ducking behind him, grabbing whatever she could to defend herself. Sparks lit up the wet concrete floor. Crates burst open, spilling contraband, guns, cash, ivory, and opium bricks. The ugly truth of the Kang Empire. By the time they reached the loading dock, Jihoon was bleeding heavily from his side. Shindara saw it, the way he slowed, the stiffness in his movement. "You're hurt," she shouted over the downpour. "Not yet," he said, half smiling through gritted teeth. "Not until you're safe." A final guard appeared at the entrance, shotgun raised. Jihoon turned to face him, but before he could fire, Shindara grabbed a rusted crowbar from the floor and swung with every ounce of strength in her body. The man went down hard. She stared at what she had done, breathing fast, trembling, shocked. Jihoon caught her hand before she could drop the weapon. His voice was soft now, almost reverent. "You saved my Shindara again," he murmured. "And you keep ruining mine," she whispered back. They stumbled out into the open air. Rain fell harder now, washing blood and dust into the sea. Jihoon collapsed against a crate, his knees giving way. Shindara knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms, her heart breaking at the sight of him, the man who'd been both her destruction and her protector. "You're losing too much blood," she said, pressing her scarf against his wound. He winced. "I've had worse." "Stop pretending," she said sharply. "You're not made of steel." For a moment they said nothing. The rain softened, drumming against the metal roof like a lullaby for the downed. Shindara's hands trembled as she worked to stop the bleeding. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why risk everything? For me?" He looked up at her, eyes heavy with pain and something deeper. "Because somewhere between your anger and your kindness, I found peace for the first time in my life." Her breath caught. "You destroyed my peace, Jihoon," she whispered. Her voice shook like glass. "But I can't hate you." He reached for her hand, weak, cold, and lifted it to his lips. The kiss was faint, trembling, full of sorrow. "Then let me protect you," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "Just once." She should have pushed him away. She should have remembered her father, her loss, her pain. But instead she leaned forward, as if drawn by something inevitable. The kiss came like confession, raw, desperate, unstoppable. Rain fell between them, on their faces, their mouths, their joined hands. It was not gentle. It was a promise broken the moment it was made. It was two people who should have been enemies, clinging to the only thing left in the storm, each other. When it broke, neither spoke for a long time. He rested his forehead against hers. "If I don't make it—" "Don't you dare," she interrupted. "You're not dying tonight." But before she could say more, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration felt like a curse. He hesitated, then answered, his hand trembling slightly. A familiar voice, deep, controlled, and cold, filled the air. "JIHOON." The sound froze him. His father, the man who ruled the Kang syndicate behind glass walls and bloodied hands. "Appa," June said quietly. "You disappoint me," the voice replied. "You burned my warehouse. You turned your gun on my men. For what? A woman?" Jihoon's jaw tightened. "She's innocent." His father chuckled, low, dangerous. No one is innocent, not in this world I built for you. Shindara looked at JIHOON, her pulse quickening. The voice on the other end radiated menace. His father continued, calm as ever. If you love her, bring her to me. The line went dead. The rain fell harder. Shindara's eyes met JIHOON's, full of disbelief and dread. He stared at the phone, then at her, the weight of the choice pressing down like the entire world had narrowed to a single command. He had crossed oceans to escape his father's shadow. Now, that shadow had found them both.
They left Lagos at dawn because dawn still felt like a promise, a thin, fragile thing that could be carried between two people who wanted to believe in new beginnings. JIHOON drove, his face set like stone. Shindara sat beside him, quiet, fingers curled around a small cloth her father had once given her. They moved through customs with papers JIHOON had arranged through channels that still obeyed his name, and they kept to roads that avoided the familiar routes where men with orders waited in the shadows. Ghana was supposed to be a refuge, a place where the sea washed the edges clean. JIHOON liked the idea of a quiet coastal town where no one would expect a Korean mob heir to hide, where Shindara could breathe without looking over her shoulder. He imagined small things for them, a room with a balcony, the smell of salt each morning, Shindara painting on a wide table while he pretended to be a man who belonged to no one. Realities are kinder in plans than in Shindara. They arrived at a villa that sat above a stretch of black sand and low, confident waves. It was simple and private. Shindara walked barefoot along the weathered planks of the veranda, letting the wind take at her hair, and JIHOON watched her as if memorizing a landscape he never wanted to lose. For 3 days they wandered between refrigerator lights and sunrise, between quiet meals and fragile attempts at normal conversation. The world outside the villa felt, for those hours, impossibly distant. One evening, after an argument that ended with them laughing instead of shouting, they found a small market where a woman hummed a lullaby in Yoruba. Shindara stopped to listen, eyes closed for a moment, and then she began to hum along. The tune was simple and old, a cradle song that named the stars and the rains and the mother's patience. JIHOON listened, unfamiliar with the words, but not with the tenderness in them. He remembered something from his childhood, a Korean lullaby his mother used to hum when there was quiet enough for memory. And in his head, the two songs braided into one. Shindara's lullaby, soft and round, the Korean melody, thin and wistful. He thought it a small miracle that two worlds could meet over song and not crash. That night on the sand, they danced, not because they chose to make a spectacle, but because the movement felt like the only honest way to speak. Shindara swayed in his arms, and JIHOON's fingers found the small of her back, cautious, learning. In that near darkness, with lantern light drawing soft circles on her face, they were not mafia or widow or fugitive. They were only two people who had found each other amid ruin. He had reasons they should never have touched the future so lightly. He had plans and debts and enemies. But when Shindara laughed and clapped, first like a child, then like a woman who had spent too long holding her breath, JIHOON let himself believe the lie of safety for a little while. Then the betrayal arrived like a shadow folding over sunlight. It came from a place he had never imagined would hurt him, from the one man he had trusted to carry his back in the darkest rooms, Minho, his right hand, the lieutenant who had been at his side for a decade. Minho was a man JIHOON had fed, clothed, and trusted with secrets. He had been the one to do the dirty work, the one who understood how to take orders and make them final. Minho did what he'd been paid to do. It began with the sound of engines, not from the nearby town, but from boats cutting the bay like knives. Men in wet clothing moved toward the villa with the quiet inevitability of tide. They arrived in darkness, but they moved with a certainty that betrayed inside knowledge. Jihoon saw the flash before the first shot, the bright bloom of a muzzle, the crack in the night. Then chaos. They hit the veranda first, men with faces set like flint, and Minho stood at the head of them. The word betrayal is too neat for what it was. Minho's face was a map of duty and something else, something colder. He raised his hand not to protect, but to acknowledge his orders. For a beat, Jihoon looked at him like one looks at a mirror after someone has scratched the glass. There was recognition, then a terrible unfamiliarity. Minho had sold them out. Gunfire ripped through the villa. Men screamed, wood splintered. Shindara moved to Jihoon's side, fear and fury a double shield. They fought down the stairs and into the hall and back out again, the night reduced to a blur of shadow and movement and the metallic taste of adrenaline. Jihoon moved with violent precision, but there were too many, and Minho's men were not clumsy. They had the plan, they had the angles, they had Jihoon's picture and the knowledge of his habits. She saw it happen. The man she held close, the man who had promised protection, the man who had bled for her and near whom she had felt alive, stumbled as the bullet tore into his shoulder. The wound was jagged. His breath became shallow. Shindara tried to pull him to cover, but a hand grabbed her hard and she was thrown against a crate. A strong voice barked orders in Korean, and she realized the ambush was organized by those who spoke Jihoon's language and understood his moves. The feel of betrayal slashed like a blade. Minho standing in the doorway with the glow of a torch behind him, not the shadow of a friend, but the silhouette of a betrayer. They were captured not because they were weak, but because the hand that should have held the door shut had opened it instead. Dragged into a low room, faces masked, Shindara's hands were bound with a cord that left crescent red marks along her wrist. The same room that once smelled of lemon oil and new paint now smelled of oil and fear. She stared at Minho as he walked in, his face unreadable, and the truth came in a cold rush. He was not acting with cruelty. He was acting with the calm of a man who had settled accounts. Minho's eyes did not flinch at the sight of Shindara. If anything, they were practical, efficient, a man who had been paid to make hard things happen. "You sold us," Jihoon spat when they faced each other, voice raw despite the bruises forming on his skin. Minho's answer was the small, sure shrug of someone who had counted the cost. "Orders," he said in Korean. "From the top." "From who?" Jihoon demanded. Minho looked at him like a man looking at a child who refused to see the world as it was. "From your father." The words landed like a hammer. Minho walked away like he had finished the job, leaving gravity to do the rest. When the men unmasked themselves for Shindara, it was like watching the last page of a book tear away. Faces she half knew from the docks, men who had been in Lagos before, stood around her like vultures. One of them smiled and tossed a small scrap of paper to the floor at her feet. She kicked it away at first, but then a motion of hands made her pick it up. It was a photograph, grainy, yellowed at the edges. The image showed a man speaking with a politician near a port office, a receipt folded into the corner, a transfer, a date. It was evidence, crude and terrible, that the pipeline she had cursed in her studio, the shipments that had corroded neighborhoods, had been a transaction, deliberate and sanctioned. A man she'd met before, a low-level enforcer who had smiled with teasing familiarity at the gallery, laughed. "You think you were targeted for no reason? Your father got in the way of profits. He had to be made an example." Shindara's breath stopped. It was as if her father's absence had a name, and it had been spoken aloud by men who had eaten his name for breakfast. Her hands moved without her mind for a moment, covering her face, feeling the old grief flare into something present and hot. "Who ordered it?" she demanded, voice raw. The man's grin faded. "You should ask his name," he said. "It's in the payments. Someone who writes checks that make generals weep. Someone whose family has never been questioned. Your father was a problem, and problems get fixed." Later alone for the smallest sliver of a moment, Shindara had a clarity that was worse than chaos. She remembered every hint of cash changing hands she'd once glimpsed walking by the docks. The men in suits leaving boxes at the port office, the governor's aides with smiles like promises. Her father had spoken against those men with a frankness that earned him enemies, and that truth had been used against him. The ledger JIHOON had shown her had been only one part of a map that led back to men who sat in buildings with thick glass and no conscience. When they finally shoved JIHOON and Shindara into the center of a grim room and informed them that the Kang patriarch had known the name of the politician who'd silenced Shindara's father for years, Shindara's world compressed. The name of the politician was the same one that appeared in the Kang ledgers, the same name printed on envelopes that had found their way into hands that decided silence. She felt the ground slip beneath her. Your father ordered it," she said, voice barely audible. JIHOON's mouth opened and closed. He had spent weeks telling himself he was not the architect of these crimes, that his hands were not stained with the grief of Shindara's family, but the ledger was a ledger. The transactions were transactions. The look in his eyes when she said the words told her he was recalculating himself around a truth he had refused to accept. "You don't understand," he said, voice shaking for the first time. "My father, he's a man who believed in control. He believed he could fix everything by buying it. He stopped, the sentence breaking like a snapped thread. He had always used language like armor, and now the armor had a fracture. Shindara's face changed. The grief that had been quiet and stored for years came up in hot shards. "Your blood killed mine," she said. The sentence was not new to her. She had rehearsed it in the dark many times, but hearing it said between them made it a verdict. JIHOON took a breath that seemed to try and migrate his sins into air. "Then let me use it to make it right," he said. It was an appeal wrapped in arrogance and abject fear. He tried to be the man who could reorder the world by force. He wanted to believe he could pay for what his family had taken. When he dropped his gun, it was an offer. Chastened, desperate. A man who had used guns his whole... Shindara handing the instrument down like a benediction. He fell to one knee, palms open, as if to show that violence was no longer his chosen way. It was theatrically simple and infinitely complicated all at once. Shindara stared at him. She felt everything tilt. Grief, fury, exhaustion, the raw ache of betrayal. Men around them shifted. Some in contempt, some in curiosity. The air smelled of damp and old cigar smoke. The world reduced to two people, a gun and a truth. She picked the gun up, the cold metal an accusing thing against her palms. Her hands trembled. The gun felt heavier than any burden she had carried in her. Shindara. Her finger hovered near the trigger. Her whole existence congealed into that single impossible decision. The room waited. She pointed the gun at him. For a fraction of a time that seemed to stretch into something like an eternity, two hearts beat in mismatched rhythm, one full of betrayal and one of pleading. The men who had orchestrated the ambush watched, and some mouthed words that sounded like prophecy. Shindara's breath came in controlled measures. She did not yet know if love could be stronger than revelation. She did not know if a gun could ever translate grief back into justice. She did not want to kill him in that moment. She wanted something else, an answer that would make her blood stop trembling. JIHOON looked up at her, the man who had once been a monster, the man who had offered protection, the man who had bled for her and near whom she had felt alive. His face was an open map of all the choices he had never been allowed to make. He did not flinch. He did not beg. He looked at her with a sorrow that had weight. Then the world narrowed to Shindara, the gun, and Jihoon's eyes. She squeezed the trigger.
The sound of the gunshot never came, only silence, deep, suffocating, and endless. The trigger rested beneath her trembling finger, and Jihoon's eyes stayed fixed on hers. Time felt disobedient, refusing to move forward. The rain outside began again, whispering against the corrugated roof like old ghosts, reminding them they were still alive. When Shindara exhaled, the sound was small but final. The gun lowered, slow and deliberate, until the barrel touched the floor. The breath she released was not forgiveness, not yet, but surrender to exhaustion, to grief, to the bitter taste of understanding. "Killing you won't heal me, Jihoon," she said quietly. Her voice cracked on his name, the syllables trembling like candlelight fighting to survive. "It'll just make me one of you." Jihoon's face broke open, not in relief, but in ruin. His hands, still open from where he had knelt, curled slowly against his knees. He had faced bullets, betrayal, his father's wrath, but mercy. Mercy was a weapon he never learned how to survive. He whispered, "Then let me do one thing right." And in that moment, the heir to the Kang crime syndicate, the man who had ruled over fear and blood, made his decision. The confession. At dawn, JIHOON disappeared. Shindara woke to an empty chair, a folded piece of paper, and the sounds of waves that didn't care who lived or died. His note was written in English, not because he couldn't write in Korean, but because he wanted her to understand every word directly, without translation. "If I live in this world, you will never be free. If I die in it, you will never forgive yourself. So I'll burn everything instead. Jay." When she found him again, it wasn't in the villa or by the shore, but on the television. A news broadcast, flickering from a small roadside shop near the Ghana border. Kang Jihoon, son of the notorious Kang Jihoon, was standing outside an Interpol safe house, surrounded by agents and reporters. His hands were raised, his wrists bound, but his face was calm, like a man who had finally remembered what peace looked like. He had turned himself in. And not just that, Jihoon had brought evidence. Years of ledgers, transaction records, offshore accounts linking the Kang syndicate to government figures in Seoul, oil smuggling networks through Lagos, and money trails that led to assassinations in both continents. He had traded it all. His father's empire, his fortune, his name, for one thing: Shindara's freedom. Shindara watched the broadcast without blinking. The reporter's words bled into static as she tried to process it. Jihoon wasn't pleading innocence. He was confessing. Every secret, every order, every crime he'd witnessed, he gave it all away, naming names in Korea, Nigeria, and Europe. He wasn't saving himself. He was erasing everything that had ever made him powerful. Every corner of Jihoon's father's empire burned in slow motion. Interpol's spokesperson called it one of the most significant dismantlings of a transnational crime network in recent history. But for Shindara, it wasn't justice. It was grief under another name. Months passed. The quiet of Lagos returned, not clean, but quieter. The ocean still sang, but differently now. Lower, sadder. Shindara moved into a small apartment near Yaba, its walls bare except for one painting she refused to sell. A portrait of two figures standing beneath rainfall,
faceless but unmistakably them. She painted again, but her colors had changed. The bright yellows of her early work were gone. In their place came deep reds, shadows of gray, streaks of cobalt blue. They weren't sad. They were alive, raw, unfiltered. For the first time, her art wasn't trying to please anyone. It was trying to breathe. At her first exhibition after the storm, a critic whispered, "There's pain in her work, but also freedom." They were right. Every stroke carried memory of gunfire, of salt water, of a man who had turned himself in because she had refused to become his executioner. One afternoon, as rain fell across the balcony again, the same kind of rain that had followed them everywhere, a small parcel arrived. The envelope was thin but stamped with Korean markings and an Interpol seal. Inside there was a letter, neatly folded, handwritten, and a ring. The ring was plain silver, slightly scratched, like something that had seen too many fights. She remembered it. Jihoon had worn it every day, simple, unassuming, his one piece of jewelry. The letter read, "Shindara, they say men like me don't change. Maybe they're right. But you taught me that guilt can still lead a man to truth. I once believed loyalty was a chain. You showed me it could be a promise. Interpol asked me why I did it. I told them it was because of a woman who saw the boy in me before the monster. In your eyes, I found what Seoul never gave me, peace. Don't wait for me. Paint. Live. Forget my name if it helps. But if you ever find yourself by the water, look for the tide that moves against the wind. That'll be me, still fighting the current, still finding my way back to you." Jihoon. Tears fell onto the paper, blurring the last few words until they became nothing but ink and memory. She slid the ring onto a chain around her neck. It wasn't a promise. It was closure.
Should Shindara forgive Jihoon? Comment your thoughts below and tell me where you're listening from. Thank you.